Welcome to The Debate. We are diving deep today into a really exhaustive new analysis detailing 5 major financial crises that have impacted the European Union. We're talking about the Santer Commission resignation, CumEx, LuxLeaks, Dieselgate, and most recently, Qatargate. When you look at these 5 cases together, spanning from the 1990s right through to this decade, the common thread seems to be this consistent pattern of, profound systemic failure.
Indeed. It's quite something. And the collective financial cost of these events is just staggering. We're easily reaching into the hundreds of billions of euros. And that's not even mentioning the severe damage done to public confidence in the whole European project. It really compels us, I think, to identify the core persistent vulnerability that lets these things keep happening.
Right. The report highlights what it calls a fundamental structural tension, where you have this deeply integrated EU single market clashing again and again with fragmented national sovereignty and, frankly, often weak institutional oversight. And that friction, that tension, it really defines our central question today. Which factor presents the greater, persistent, systemic vulnerability to the EU's integrity? Is it that structural tension, the inherent fragmentation of the single market, or is it the institutional and cultural failures within the EU bodies themselves that seem to foster opacity and ultimately lead to regulatory capture?
It's a crucial distinction, absolutely. Because how we answer that really defines where we focus our efforts if we want lasting reform.
Okay, so I'll stake out my position. I believe the fundamental structural mismatch, this gap between integrated finance, trade, capital on one side, and then highly fragmented national governance, tax, enforcement on the other, I think that is the primary and most enduring vulnerability. Until that structural tension is resolved, the system itself will always offer these catastrophic arbitrage opportunities.
And I come at it from a slightly different angle. I'd argue that yes, structural gaps are sort of a constant, but they only really become explosive crises when the EU's own internal control mechanisms are, captured or perhaps arrogant or simply ineffective. For me, the deeper and importantly, the correctable problem lies in institutional and cultural failure, in a lack of political will perhaps, to govern robustly and to hold itself properly accountable.
I see why you think that, but let me offer a different perspective, focusing first on just the sheer scale of the financial exploitation we've seen. The most damaging scandals, I contend, arise precisely from this structural mismatch. Take the colossal CumEx tax fraud. This was a scheme so complex, it essentially stole somewhere between $55 billion and maybe $150 billion across Europe.
The sheer brazenness of CumEx is stunning, it has to be said.
It is, and it's the premier example for me of structural tension at work. This criminal network didn't need to break down a single wall. They ruthlessly exploited the gap between the seamless flow of capital across the single market, which is, the EU's great achievement, and these siloed national tax authorities that simply could not track the transactions rapidly enough or cooperatively enough. The system was, designed to let capital flow, but it failed fundamentally to build a mechanism to police it centrally. And look also at LuxLeaks. That wasn't just individual criminal activity. That was effectively state-sanctioned tax avoidance. You had Luxembourg using these advanced tax rulings to help hundreds of multinationals legally erode the tax bases of its fellow EU nations, costing them, $50 billion to $70 billion annually? That is the very definition of national tax sovereignty being weaponized for harmful tax competition. When one member state profits directly from the decline of others within the same shared market, the architecture itself feels broken, doesn't it? It encourages systemic decline.
I understand the mechanism of financial loss you're describing, but if we look at where let's say the rot began, I think the deepest wounds stem from internal decay, not just structural design flaws. I would point to the kind of origin story of institutional integrity crises in the EU, the Santer Commission resignation back in 1999. Now, this wasn't about tax fragmentation at all. It was about pure, unadulterated institutional arrogance, a sort of closed culture that routinely dismissed parliamentary inquiries and allowed internal mismanagement and, yes, fraud to flourish pretty much unchecked. The internal anti-fraud unit at the time, ULAF, the predecessor to OLAF, it manifestly failed. The entire system suffered a systemic loss of political control. The failure here, I argue, was one of accountability, a political leadership and internal culture, not simply market design. Structural gaps exist, sure, but they only become financially catastrophic when the people responsible for oversight choose to look the other way or are perhaps just too complacent to act effectively.
I acknowledge that the Santer crisis was a necessary reckoning for internal accountability, absolutely. However, these external scandals, they expose the fragility of the governance structure itself. Look at Dieselgate. The report notes that manufacturers like Volkswagen engage in blatant regulatory arbitrage. They were essentially shopping for the most lenient national type approval authority, in this case the German KBA, to certify non-compliant cars for the entire bloc. The structural weakness here seems clear. The EU relies on 27 different national regulators to approve products for the whole continent. If just one national regulator prioritizes its own domestic champions over the collective EU rules, well, systemic failure isn't just possible, it's almost guaranteed. National economic interests, I believe, inevitably supersede collective oversight when that structural conflict of interest is baked into the regulatory system.
I'm sorry, but I just don't quite buy that the problem is purely structural there. Dieselgate, which you cite, is also, I think, a textbook example of internal cultural failure. Look, the EU's own Joint Research Center, the JRC, they detected anomalous emissions and they suspected the use of a defeat device as early as 2010. They actually alerted the Commission. Yet those internal warnings, they weren't acted upon or escalated properly. That inaction allowed the fraud to continue for 5 more years until the US EPA finally intervened. That to me sounds like a failure of internal regulatory willpower and leadership, not necessarily a design flaw that requires abolishing national regulators altogether. The system had the intelligence, it just lacked the will to execute. And let's look then at Qatargate, the most recent scandal hitting the European Parliament. That corruption wasn't enabled by a clash of tax codes or fragmented banking oversight, was it? It was proof, I'd argue, of a deep-seated culture of impunity within the parliament itself. And this was enabled by a self-policing ethics framework, a weak revolving door policy, allowing former MEPs like Panzeri to immediately transition into high-level lobbying, and just insufficient mandatory transparency for third country influence. The failure even now to create a truly independent, cross-institutional ethics body after Qatargate, despite the huge public scandal, that's a choice. It feels like a failure of political will, not an inherent structural design problem. The capacity for reform exists, the courage to implement it seems absent.
Let's focus back maybe on the weaponization of complexity, because this is where I think structure dictates institutional failure. In those big financial crises, Cum-Ex and LuxLeaks, the complexity involved was specifically designed to exploit fragmented oversight. If the power to police high finance and corporate taxation remains fragmented, remains national, the sheer scale of cross-border activity in the single market guarantees these schemes will continue, almost regardless of the internal intentions of Commission officials.
So, policy inertia providing the ultimate arbitrage opportunity.
Exactly. And the fact that crucial reforms, things like the Anti-Tax Avoidance Directive, ATAD, and the Mandatory Information Exchange under DAC 3, they were only forced onto the political agenda by the sheer magnitude of the LuxLeaks crisis, well, that shows profound resistance to addressing the core sovereignty issue that enables the exploitation in the first place. The structural resistance, national governments fiercely protecting their fiscal authority, that's the primary obstacle. It makes institutional inaction the expected outcome, I'd argue, not the root cause.
That's an interesting point, though I might frame it differently. I think perhaps you're mistaking the location of the crisis for the cause of the crisis. Yes, complexity exists, but it only worked because national authorities were either, let's say, amenable, like the Luxembourg tax administration clearly was in LuxLeaks, or they were passively siloed, like the German tax authorities perhaps were in Cum-Ex. The core problem wasn't necessarily the complexity itself, but the lack of an independent EU-level body with the mandate and, crucially, the resources to actually penetrate that complexity across different jurisdictions. If the political will existed to create, say, a unified tax enforcement body, or even a proper financial crimes unit for the EU, we probably would have seen these structures emerge long ago. The absence of that unified body feels like a political failure, not some unavoidable structural necessity.
But unifying oversight is ceding sovereignty. That is the structural barrier we're talking about. The national resistance to that very unified body you describe is precisely the structural tension. The structure, I argue, prevents the political will from achieving critical mass, except maybe during these moments of extreme crisis.
Okay, let's move to the consistent pattern regarding external scrutiny then. This is perhaps, for me, the most damning evidence against internal institutional efficacy. There's a striking repeated pattern here. All 5 of these major scandals were exposed primarily by external actors, whistleblowers like Paul Van Butenten back in the day, or Antoine Deltour more recently, investigative journalists, or even non-EU regulators like the US EPA. This really highlights, doesn't it, the fundamental weakness of the EU's internal audit and enforcement functions. Why did the internal anti-fraud unit, USLAF, fail so completely in 1999? Why didn't the Commission act decisively on the JRC warnings back in 2010? Why was Qatargate broken by Belgian police raids and not the Parliament's own ethics committee finding something? This continuous reliance on external pressure suggests internal systems are fundamentally deficient in their own accountability mechanisms.
The internal culture might just be too risk-averse, perhaps too self-protective.
I'm not entirely convinced by that line of reasoning, because external scrutiny is necessary precisely because of the structural fragmentation that you claim is secondary. Let's go back to Dieselgate for a second. The US EPA succeeded in exposing it because they had unified regulatory power over a unified US market. Simple as that. When they tested a car, their ruling applied universally, and importantly, immediately. In contrast, the EU system relies on national authorities enforcing collective rules, and the evidence shows they consistently fail to do that completely. Even after Dieselgate blew up, millions of highly polluting cars remained on EU roads for years because of slow, inconsistent, and incomplete national enforcement actions. The failure isn't just one of competence or leadership, maybe. It's the inherent conflict of interest when a national regulator, like Germany's KBA, is charged with policing its own domestic champions. The structure permits, I'd say even encourages, this conflict. Because the national regulator's primary loyalty often lies with its own economy, not necessarily the collective integrity of the EU rulebook.
But you're describing a conflict of interest, which comes down to a political choice, doesn't it? That conflict is only truly relevant if the institution chooses to tolerate it through, say, weak reporting standards or a lack of real independence for its own watchdogs. If the Commission had mustered the political courage to follow up properly on the JRC's findings back in 2010, they could have applied collective pressure regardless of any national regulator reluctance. The will wasn't there.
Well, we can certainly agree, I think, with the report's finding that reform is overwhelmingly reactive. It seems it's forged in the crucible of public scandal. The EU project perhaps only moves forward significantly through disaster.
Yes, that seems undeniable.
And I argue that this reaction is necessary precisely to overcome the inertia caused by national resistance to ceding sovereignty. Only a crisis of the magnitude of LuxLeaks, where public trust was just utterly eroded, could force the Council to finally adopt directives like DAC 3, which required the automatic exchange of tax rulings between member states. Crisis, I argue, becomes the only political tool strong enough to break that structural tension between national authority and the integrity of the common market.
I agree that crisis facilitates change, of course, but the speed and the depth of that change, I think, reveal the institutional limits. The continued existence of harmful tax competition even after LuxLeaks, and crucially, the continued political resistance to establishing a truly independent, cross-institutional ethics body after Qatargate, well, that shows that the institutions choose not to be proactive. They are capable of reform. They created OLAF, they adopted ATAD, they brought in R2B testing post-Dieselgate, but the internal political culture allows deep vulnerabilities, like self-policing ethics in the parliament, to persist until the next inevitable collapse in public trust. This suggests, to me, a prioritization of political convenience over genuine systemic integrity.
So, to summarize my position, the material demonstrates, I think quite overwhelmingly, that the greatest persistent threat is structural. What the evidence shows is that unless we can somehow match our deeply integrated single market with more centralized sovereignty over fiscal matters and enforcement, these structural gaps will just continue to provide opportunities for arbitrage and exploitation. And that creates a continuous, perhaps even unavoidable threat to collective EU financial integrity.
And my analysis reveals that while yes, structural gaps provide the opportunity for misconduct, the EU has repeatedly shown it possesses the legal capacity to fight fraud. But it's repeatedly hampered by institutional failures, by cultural opacity, which we saw clearly in the internal arrogance that led to Santer's downfall, and the, well, deliberate impunity maybe, that enabled Qatargate, and by a fundamental lack of political courage to establish rigorous, independent internal oversight. The will to govern effectively is the missing, most essential, and I believe the most correctable piece of the puzzle.
The history of these 5 major financial crises certainly underscores that the European project is engaged in an ongoing, quite unfinished battle to safeguard both its financial interests and its democratic integrity.
Absolutely. We leave the listener, perhaps, to weigh whether the core problem is one of fundamental structural design, which would demand a painful ceding of national sovereignty, or if it's more a question of institutional determination and political will, which demands above all courage from its leadership.